to another coffee tasting. I'm your host, Aaron Taylor, and today we're doing a special coffee tasting. Today's coffee tasting is going to be dedicated to the Black History Month, and so we're going to talk a little bit about culture and history of the Black culture, and we're going to talk a little bit about Kenya. This story isn't going to be a very happy story. There is a lot of stuff that happened in this region of the world, and it goes to show all the different things that African Americans and Africans in general went through poverty and mistreatment throughout the history. So the reason why we're delving into this story is obviously because of Black History Month, and also because we can't learn from our past unless we know the stories of our past. And so to better avoid making the mistakes that we did and the mistreatment of people, to avoid making those mistakes in the future, we kind of have to really learn the stories of our past and learn what happened, what really happened, so that we can use that knowledge to avoid making the same mistakes. So today we're tasting the Kenya Baragwi, which is a really, really good cup of coffee. It's got like light notes of cherry with little slightly bitter notes as well. And we're going to be tasting that on the French press and the pour over. And the reason why I chose this coffee is because it has a very interesting story in the terms of Black history and the area of Africa when it comes to British colonialism and how it evolved over time. So we're going to talk a little bit about how it began, how it evolved, and then how they slowly began to acquire their own rights and access to their own lands. Thank you guys for joining me today. If you guys are joining me for the first time, go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button down below. That helps out this channel so much. That way I can continue doing this channel in the future. If you guys are joining me for a second time or just rejoining the channel, welcome back. And if you haven't had the opportunity to hit that like and subscribe button, please hit that like and subscribe button down below. That really helps out the channel. It's going to help me continue to make more content and even delve further into different types of content in this channel when it comes to the history of coffee and the history of the world. So thank you guys so much for doing that. So we're going to get into this coffee tasting. So when I do my coffee tastings, I like to do my coffee tastings two different ways. I do my coffee tastings on a pour over and a French press. And the reason why I do the pour over and the French press is because they're pretty much two opposite spectrums of the coffee brewing table. And so with the French press, we're going to see a lot of those sediments and those oils make its way into the cup of coffee, while the pour over, the paper filter is going to absorb some of those oils and absorb most of the sediments. So we're going to end up with a cleaner cup of coffee. More of the bright acidic flavors from the African coffee is going to make its way through, while on the French press, we're going to see more of those bitter flavors make its way through. So for this particular cup of coffee, I think I'm going to like the French press more, but we will find out here in just a moment. So with the Kenya region, it has a very, very long history in terms of oppression to the people of that region. There's a lot of British colonialism going on there, and then there was even some conflict between Germany and the British between over land rights and wanting to expand their farmlands. So we're going to talk a little bit about that, how it shaped the area, and then we're going to slowly get to the point where they started to gain their independence, which they're still fighting over for today. There's still a constant conflict going on over in that part of the world with like the indigenous tribes and just people fighting for land. It's still a thing today. It's not as intense as it was back in the day, but there is a lot of political stuff going on right now for claiming different parts of the land that some people don't initially have the rights to because they were stolen from a particular group of people. So with this story, it all starts in 1895 when the British government took over and claimed the interior as far as Lake Naivasha, and it set up the East Africa Protectorate, the EAP. And so the border was extended to Uganda in 1902, and in 1920 the enlarged protectorate, except for the original coastal strip, which remained a protectorate, became a crown colony with the beginning of colonial rule in 1895. And this land became reserved for whites in the 1920s. Indians objected to the reservation for the highlands for Europeans, especially British war veterans. And so, way back in the day, this land was claimed by the British, taken away from the British, and used as like kind of like a getaway for war veterans, and a place for war veterans, if they had enough money or enough money to their name, that they can go there and buy land for very cheap from the British government and create farms. And so that's how that all started. And so this area's fertile land was always made at the site of migration and conflict. There was no significant mineral resources, none of the gold or diamonds that affected a lot of other regions of South Africa. So with this particular region of Kenya, it was all about farmland, being able to have that rich, luscious land to be able to grow food and resources. And then it was shortly after that, Imperial Germany set up a protectorate over the Sultan Zanzibar coastal possessions, followed by the arrival of Sir William Mackensen, British East Africa Company, the BEAC, in 1888, after the company had received royal charter and concessionary rights to the Kenya coast from the Sultan of Zanzibar for a 50-year period. So the Imperial Germany made a deal with the Sultan of Zanzibar for a 50-year period to be able to use their lands for a royal charter. And then, the colonial resistance, the colonial takeover was met occasionally with strong resistance. One of those strong leaders was the Wayaki Wahinga, or Kikuyu chief, who ruled Dagoretti, who was signed a treaty with Frederick Lugard of the BEAC, having been subject to considerable harassment. And then in 1890, Wayaki was abducted 2 years later by the British and killed because of the resistances that he led. So these are one of those stories where, like, these cultures were being taken advantage of because of their slightly less technological advancement, and so they could easily be exploited. And it's just really not fair for this particular region of the world. And then with Wayaki Wahinga, or Kikuyu chief, sorry guys for mispronouncing some of these names, they're pretty wild. So this guy, he fought for what he believed in, and he fought for the independence of the people of the land, and then he ended up getting abducted and killed by the British colonials. And so that just highlights the hostility that some of these people went through back in the day. All right. So now we've got our foot a little bit into the door. We've talked a little bit about the tragedy of the region, and there's plenty more tragedy to come, you guys. This is what's important about this story, is the tragedy of the story, and then how they were able to rebuild from this tragedy and come back, and the strength of the African communities from around the world and their perseverance. So let's go ahead and taste this coffee. First, we're going to taste the pour over, and then after we're done tasting the coffee, we're going to explore this story a little bit more. Okay, so with the pour over, we're seeing a lot of those bright notes right off the bat. Ooh, that's really good. That's a really good pour over. So with this particular cup of coffee, it's very, very smooth. We're getting a lot of those bright citrusy notes right off the bat, but then we're still getting like that mellow bitterness towards the center of our tongue, and that's actually really nice. What we want to look for, because neither one of those flavors are overpowering the palate of my tongue right now. And so it's a very, very smooth cup of coffee. Now, as I let the palate clear, the only flavors that's kind of lingering is kind of like a roasty flavor, like a bright roasty flavor towards the back of my tongue, and it's specifically on the right side of my tongue, which is very interesting. It's not like a full wash all over my tongue. It's generally on this side. That is a really good cup of coffee. Nice and smooth. I really like that. Nice and smooth. All right, so now let's taste the French press. With the French press, we're going to see more intense flavors. With this cup, I think we're going to see a little bit more of that bright acidic flavor because the bright acidity is so intense on the pour over. We're probably going to see a little bit more of that acidic flavor in the French press as well. But it does have a reasonable amount of bitterness in the pour over, so that might actually kind of take the front seat or the driver, the wheel if you will, of this particular cup. So let's go ahead and find out what the flavor notes are. The Kenya Baragwi on the French press. So immediately right off the bat, we're getting a lot more of those bitter notes from the scent of the coffee. It's still got that bright acidic smell, but much stronger in those bitter notes. Wow, that is really good. So what we're seeing here right now is we're seeing a lot of those bright, fruity, floral notes. And the bitter flavors have really, really taken a backseat on this cup of coffee. This is so bright and florally, it almost tastes as if like I put like a rose petal on my tongue. That's how florally this is. And it's got like a really strong, bright flavor. So you just immediately hit with that floral, bright acidicness. And then that bitter flavor that you get from the pour over is almost non-existent. Like it's completely gone from the cup. And then the nice thing about this particular cup of coffee is it doesn't linger on. It doesn't attach to the tongue. Normally when you get like a really bright acidic or florally coffee, you get like those lingering floral flavors on your tongue, and it leaves you with a dry palate feeling. And so you want something savory to pair with it to combat that dry tongue feeling. With this, because it doesn't linger on and it kind of dissipates pretty quick, you do get that initial floral punch right off the bat, but it washes away pretty quick. So you're left with a full body mouth flavor, but it washes away fairly clean. So you don't get that dry mouth feeling or just like an uncomfortable lingering effect. So that is really good. If I had to choose a coffee between these two, the French press or the pour over, I would probably choose the pour over, just because we're getting more of those bitter flavors, which counterbalances that bright acidic flavor. But either or is really good. The French press, if you really like tea, any kind of like floral tea, like a black tea, you would really like the French press because we're really seeing a lot of those floral notes come through with this coffee. And so the reason why we're seeing a lot of those floral notes is because typical to this region, they sun dry their coffee. And when you sun dry your coffee, you're going to get your cherries that they turn into raisins on top of the bean. And so that moisture and those flavors of the cherry actually get absorbed into the bean during the dry process. And that's where a lot of those bright, fruity, floral flavors come from. While if you were to do like a full wash or a semi-wash, you're not going to get as much of those berry juices or that citrusy flavor being absorbed into the bean because it makes its way into the wash of the water rather than into the bean. So that's how the wash and the processing method affects the flavor of the coffee, and then that's how the particular region where the coffee comes from affects the washing method. Because this particular region of the world has a very dry climate, not very humid, they have the opportunity to dry their beans, and with very little maintenance, don't have to worry about mold arising and stuff. You still have to, rotate the beans and rake the bed so that you don't get any mold. But in an area where if it was very tropical, lots of humidity, you would have to constantly be monitoring the cherries if you wanted to sun dry them, and that's even if you had the right the right amount of sunlight to create a sun-dried bean. Some areas they have too much cloud cover, or it's just not enough sunlight to sun-dry bean, and with the amount of moisture, you would end up just creating mold. So you have to either do a semi-wash or a fully wash. And so with those semi-washes and fully washes, you're going to get different flavors from the bean. So that impacts the flavor incredibly when you're processing the coffee. All right. So French press, really, really good on the Kenya Baragwi, but I prefer the pour over. All right. So let's explore Kenya Baragwi a little bit further. And so we just got done talking about how the chief of Kikuyu was abducted and assassinated by the British colony. And then so shortly after that, let's see. So shortly after that, the British government had decided to, primarily for strategic reasons, to build a railway linking the Mombasa with the British protectorate of Uganda. The major feat of engineering the Uganda Railway, that is the railway inside Kenya leading to Uganda, was completed in 1903 and was a decisive event in modernizing the era, as the governor of Kenya, Sir Percy Garrard, was instrumental in initiating railway extension policy that led to construction of the Nairobi, Thika, and Konza Magadi railways. And so with this railway, it was an important innovation for the area, but it's not there was a lot of negativity. So 32,000 workers were imported to work on this railway. And so it was manual labor camps that really built this railway. So it's not the greatest. It helped the area, but the way that it was executed is not a great way. Using forced labor in importing workers from different parts of the world to work on it. Not the greatest thing. Another example on why on just the impact of the world and how a lot of people were treated unfairly by a specific group of people. And so by the time the railway was built, military resistance by the African population to the original British takeover had petered out. However, new grievances were being generated by the process of European settlement. Governor Percy Garrard is associated with the debacle of the Second Maasai Agreement of 1911, which led to their forceful removal of their fertile Laikipia plateau of semi-arid Ngong. So as this new accord came out, they're kicking more people out of their land. They're claiming more land, forcefully kicking people out, and people are losing their farms, their homeland, and being forced to go to other parts of the world and work for this British colony. And so, in the initial stage of the colonial rule, the administration relied traditionally on communicators, usually chiefs, when colonial rule was established and efficiently was sought. Partly because of the settler pressure, newly educated younger men were associated with old chiefs and local native councils, and that's so that they can pretty much use these younger men and teach them to communicate with the local tribe chiefs and then communicate with the British. And so it was a way so that the British can communicate with the local tribes, and then also at the same time, these communicators weren't used in a nice, fashionable way. They were used in a way to manipulate these tribes and get them to do what they wanted them to do. So it wasn't like, hey, I want you to communicate this to them so that we can help each other out. It was more or less like, hey, I need you to tell them this or we're going to do this. And if they don't do this, we're going to do this. And we need them to do that or we're going to do this. So it was a very, very aggressive relationship, and these communicators were used as a form of carrying those threats over from the British colonies to these local African tribes. And so now we're approaching the First World War, and Kenya actually became a military base for the British in the First World War in 1914 to 1918 as an effort to subdue the German colony to the south. And in the outbreak of war in August 1914, the governor of the British East Africa and the German East Africa agreed to. In 1914, the governments agreed to a truce in an attempt to keep the young colonies out of direct hostilities. However, Lieutenant Cole Paul von Littau took command of the German military forces, determined to tie down as many British resources as possible, completely cut off from Germany. Von Littau conducted an effective guerrilla warfare campaign, living off the land, capturing British supplies, and remaining undefeated. He eventually surrendered in Zambia 11 days after the armistice was signed in 1918. To chase von Littau, the British deployed Indian Army troops from India and then needed large numbers of porters to overcome the formidable logistics of transporting supplies. So this is another story about how the Africans really paid the price for two different people fighting over land. So you have World War I with the British and the Germans fighting over supremacy over Africa, and you have the British in the north and the Germans in the south fighting over farmland and trying to make a hold on different resources, trying to choke the other out of the land. And so with this happening, the local Africans are really the victim of two other states at war, and they're kind of like over here like, hey, like, you know, this is our land and you guys are over here fighting over our land, and it's, you know, that's just not right. And so that's why we're talking about this story, and like why like how it was wrong, and learning the story so that we can avoid making these mistakes in the future. Alright, so now we're going to jump a little bit into the future. We're going to go all the way to World War II. In the Second World War, Kenya became another important British military base for the successful campaigns against Italy in the Italian Somaliland and Ethiopia. The war brought money and an opportunity for military services for 98,000 men called ascaris. The war stimulated African nationalism. After the war, African ex-servicemen sought to maintain the socio-economic gains they had accrued through service in the King's African Rifles, KAR. Looking for middle-class employment and social privileges, they challenged existing relationships with the colonial state for the most part. Veterans did not participate in national politics, believing in their aspirations could best be achieved within the confines of colonial society. The social economic connotations of KAR service combined with the massive wartime expansion of Kenya Defense Forces created a new class of modernist Africans with distinctive characteristics and interests. These socio-economic perceptions proved powerful after the war. And so what that means is they're seeing these economic changes within their social structure, and they don't want to lose that. You start making more money because you serve in the military, and then the war ends up dying down, or the war in your area ceases, and you go back to everyday life. And that means you're no longer being paid on a military wage and stuff like that. So by experiencing those socio-economical changes, they wanted to keep those socio-economical changes and kind of like better the land. So in let's see, is that what I wanted to talk about? So, as a reaction to their exclusion from political representation, the Kikuyu people, the most subject to pressure by the settlers, founded in 1921 Kenya's first African political protest movement in the Young Kikuyu Association led by Harry Thuku. After the Young Kikuyu Association was banned by the government, it was replaced by the Kikuyu Central Association in 1924. In 1944, Thuku founded and was the first chairman of the multi-tribal Kenyan African Study Union, the KASU, which in 1946 became the Kenya African Union, the KAU. It was an African nationalist organization that demanded access to white-owned land. So this is important because this is the movement in Africa, in the Kenya-Pacific region, where they started to demand their land back. They started to demand for the rights, and this is when the local uprising really took a stand. Let's see. The KAU demanded nominated by ethics group. However, the leadership of the KAU was multi-tribal. Wycliffe Awawi was the first vice president, followed by Tom Mbotela. In 1947, Jomo Kenyatta, former president of the moderate Kikuyu Central Association, became president of more aggressive KAU to determine a greater political voice for Africans. In an effort to gain nationwide support of KAU, Jomo Kenyatta visited Kisumu in 1952. His effort to build up support for KAU in Nyanza inspired Odinga, the kerchief of the Luo Union, an organization that represented members of the Luo community in East Africa, to join the KAU and delve into politics. In response to the rising pressure, the British Colonial Office broadened the membership of the Legislative Council and increased its role. By 1952. A multiracial pattern of quotas allowed for 14 Europeans, 1 Arab, 6 Asians elected members, together with an additional 6 Africans and 1 Arab member chosen by the governor. The Council of Ministers became the principal instrument of government in 1954. So that's important because now we're starting to see a little bit of equality going on, people being allowed on the memberships of the boards in the area, with the 6 Africans, 1 Arab, and some Asians, and then Europeans as well. With Europeans still dominating the board, it was still a major step in that region to have different cultures being allowed to sit on the board. Even though it's still wrong, they're starting to take steps in the right direction. A key watershed came from 1952 to 1956 during the Mau Mau uprising, an armed local movement principally against the colonial government and the European settlers. It was the largest and most successful movement in British Africa members of the 40 Group World War II. Veterans including Stanley Mething, Bilal Kagia, and Fred Kubai became core leaders in the rebellion they're experiencing during World War II, awakened their political consciousness, giving them determination and confidence to change the system. Key leaders of the KAU, known as Kapengurai 6, sorry again guys for mispronouncing some of these words, were arrested on the 21st of October. They included Jomo Kenyatta, Paul Ngai, Kunyu Karumba, Bilal Kaya, Fred Kubai, and Asheng Oneko. Kenyatta denied he was a leader of the Mau Mau, but was convicted at trial and was sent to prison in 1953, gaining his freedom 8 years later in 1961. An intense propaganda campaign by the colonial government effectively discouraged other Kenyan community settlers and international communities from sympathizing with the movement by emphasizing on real and perceived acts of barbarianism. So they used propaganda and paper leaflets to trick the other local Kenyans into thinking that this Mau Mau group was just an extremist group that was just violent, and that's all that they cared about was committing acts of violence, when really these people were just fighting for the right of their homeland and really looking to take it back. And so with this propaganda, they really started to suppress the region again, and really kind of hiding that fact that this particular land really belongs to them. And so that's another thing on why we're celebrating Black History Month, is because the people of this particular land were oppressed for so long and being taken advantage of and manipulated in such a way. So it's important to learn these stories so that we can really learn like everything that this particular group in this particular area of the world went through. Another notable example was the pioneer and lawyer, the first East African to obtain a law degree. He became known as the Mau Mau lawyer, as he would successfully defend Africans accused of Mau Mau crimes pro bono. The British killed over 12,000 Mau Mau militants and implemented policies involving the forced relocation of local people from the fertile highlands to make way for white colonial settlers, and the incarceration of over 150,000 men and women and children in concentration camps. British authorities used rape, concentration, lit cigarettes on tinder spots, and electric shock to torture Kenyans. And so this is another sad and horrifying thing that the British did to local Kenyans to take away their land. They used the Mau Mau situation to incarcerate the locals and send them to concentration camps under false suspicion of being part of the Mau Mau movement. And really the Mau Mau movement was just they exploited this movement to justify the acts that they committed in the Kenya region when they forced these 150,000 men and women into the concentration camps. And so this is a major impact on the community of Kenya, and the horrifying things that happened to the people there through white colonialism. The Although all these bad things did happen involving the Mau Mau movement and the exploitation of it, and the British taking advantage of certain events, the Mau Mau uprising set in play a series of events that expedited the road to Kenya's independence. And so that's what this story is really about: is the independence the of the African person, the black culture. And in order to learn about the independence, we have to learn the dark history that led to their oppression. And it's not the nicest story, and I'm personally not at all proud of my history or my ancestors' history. And this is why we're learning these stories, is so that we can the humility of it all. I know that I wasn't part of this history personally, but just the fact that it being a part of my ancestors' past, I am terribly sorry for all the things that they've done, even though I can't change it. And the only thing that we can do is learn about these stories so that we can have greater respect for the African people and the trials that they went through. And so now we have these paths being paved way through the Mau Mau uprising for the Kenya's independence. A royal commission on land and population condemned the reservation of land on a racial basis to support a military campaign of counterinsurgency of colonial government embarked on agrarian reform that stripped white settlers of many of the former protections. So they're starting to put things in place that don't allow for particular groups of people to take land for military operations and really restrict it to specific racial rights. Thuku was one of the first Kikuyu to win a coffee license, and in 1959 he became the first African board member of the Kenyan Planters Coffee Union. The East African Salaries Commission put forth the recommendation equal pay for equal work that was immediately accepted. Racist policies in public places and hotels were eased. John David Drummond, 17th Earl of Perth and Minister of State of Colonial Affairs, stated, "The effort required to suppress Mau Mau destroyed any settlers' illusions that they could get it alone. The British government was not prepared for the shedding of more blood in order to preserve colonial rule." So what the Mau Mau uprising and the suppression of the Mau Mau uprising was, it really opened up the eyes of the population of the Kenya. They realized that they weren't going to be able to get independence alone, that they had to stand together and stand with the Mau Mau movement to ensure their freedom and independence. And one of the leaders of the Mau Mau movement, Thuku, was one of the first people to gain a coffee license and really gain his own independence through business, and start cultivating coffee. So the pioneers of the trade union movement were Makan Singh, Fred Kubai, and Bilal Kagi, all former members of the Mau Mau movement. 1935, Makan Singh started the Labor Trade Union of Kenya. In 1940, Fred Kubai started the Transport Allied Workers Union, and Bilal Kagia founded the Clerks of Commercial Workers Union in 1949. Makan Singh and Fred Kubai started the East Africa Trade Union Congress. They organized strikes, including the railway worker strike in 1939, and protested against granting of a royal charter to Nairobi in 1950. So there were uprisings against the construction of the railway when it came to rights, and them seeing how this railway was going to help the British take more land from them. So they really needed to take control in order to not lose more land to the British colonialism. After the suppression of the Mau Mau rising, the British provided for the election of the 6 African members to the Legislative Council, the MLC. under a weighted franchise based on education. Moboya successfully stood for office in the first election for African MLCs in 1957, beating the previously nominated incumbent Arguing's Codec. Sorry guys, again. Daniel Arap Moi was the only previously nominated African MLC who kept his seat. Oginga Odinga was also elected and shortly nominated as the first chairman of the African elected members. Moboya's party, the Nairobi People's Convention Party, NPCP, was inspired by Kwame Nkrumah's People Convention Party. It became the most organized and effective political party in the country. The NPCP was used to effectively mobilize the masses in Nairobi in the struggle for greater African representation on the council. The new colonial constitution of 1958 increased African representation, but African nationalists began to demand a democratic franchise on the principle of one man, one vote. However, Europeans and Asians, because of their minority positions, feared the effects of universal suffrage. So the British and the Asians, because they were the minority in the region, felt like their vote wasn't going to count in this democratic vote because of the fact that they're a minority, that the wider population of the Africans would outweigh their vote. And that's true, but that's important because they are the primary residents of that particular land, so they should have the right to say. In June 1958, Oginga Odinga called for the release of Jomo Kenyatta. This call built momentum and was taken up by the NPCP, agitated for the African suffrage, and self-rule picked up in pace. The major hindrance to self-rule was the lack of African human capital, poor education, economic development, and a lack of African technocrats were a real problem. This inspired Tom Moboya to begin a program conceptualized by a close confidant, Dr. Blasio Vincent Oriedo, funded by Americans, of sending talented youth to the United States for higher education. There was no university in Kenya at the time, but colonial officials opposed the program anyway. The next year, Senator John F. Kennedy helped fund the program, hence its popular name, the Kennedy Airlift. At a conference held in the 1960s in London, agreement was reached between the African members of the British settlers of the New Kenya group led by Michael Blundell. However, many whites rejected the New Kenya group and condemned the London Agreement because it moved away from racial quotas and toward independence. Following the agreement of New African Party, the Kenya African National Union, KANU, with the slogan Uhuru, or Freedom, was formed under the leadership of Kikuyu leader James S. Gichuru. So this is important to say too, because this is only 80 years ago, 82 years or 81 years ago, 1960 is when the members of the New Kenya group brought this thing to the London Agreement, and a lot of white board members opposed of it because they were asking for independence, and they didn't like that. And this was only 80 years ago. That's not that long ago. That's almost half of, like, I'm almost half that age. So it's like that's very, very recent. So the development of African independence and is very, very young and very recent, which is, it's wild to think how not that long ago these events were taking place. And if your grandma or great grandma is alive, or if your grandparents or great grandparents are still around, they were alive to see these events take place in the news if they were being talked about in the local newspaper. And so that's how young these historic events are. It wasn't that long ago when Africans are fighting for their independence in their own country. Once in power, Kenyatta swerved from radical nationalism to conservative bourgeois politics. The plantations formerly owned by white settlers were broken up and given to farmers, with the Kikuyu the favored recipients, along with their allies, the Imbu and the Meru. By 1978, most of the country's wealth and power was in the hands of the organization which grouped these three tribes, the Kikuyu Imbu Meru Associations, GEMA, together comprising 30% of the population. At the same time, the Kikuyu, with the Kenyatta support, spread beyond their traditional territorial homeland and repossessed lands stolen by the whites, even when these had previously belonged to other groups. The other groups, a 70% majority, were outraged, setting up long-term ethnic animosities. The minority party, the Kenya African Democratic Union, KADU, represented a coalition of small tribes that had feared dominance by larger ones. Dissolved itself voluntarily in 1964. The former members joined KANU. The KANU was the only party 1964 to 66 when a faction broke away as a Kenya People's Union, the KPU. It was led by Jaramogi Oginga Odinga, a former vice president of the Luo Elder. KPU advocated the more scientific route to socialism, criticizing the slow progress in land redistribution and employment opportunities, as well as a realignment of foreign policy in favor of the Soviet Union. So what we have here is we have land that's being retaken back by the Kikuyu people. But with that land that was taken away, it didn't originally belong to just the Kikuyu people. It belonged to three different tribes. And with the uneven redistribution of farms and the Kikuyu people being prioritized over other tribes, these other tribes, people that were part of these other tribes felt like they were being treated unfairly, and so they started their own group, their own union, called the Kenya's People's Union. Criticizing the slow progress in land redistribution and employment opportunities, as well as the alignment of foreign policy in favor of the Soviet Union, on the 25th of February 1965, Pio Gama Pinto of Kenya of Goan descent and freedom fighter who was detained during the colonial period, was assassinated in what is recognized as Kenya's first political assassination. He was also Oginga Odinga's chief tactician and linked to the Eastern Bloc. His death dealt a severe blow to the Oginga Odinga's organizational efforts. The government used a variety of political and economic measures to harass the KPU and its prospective and actual members. The KPU branches were unable to register KPU meetings and were prevented, and civil servants and politicians suffered severe economic and political consequences for joining the KPU. A security act that was passed in Parliament in July 1966 and granted the government powers to carry out detention without trial was used against the KPU members in a series of down raids in August in 1966. Several KPU party members were arrested and detained without trial. They included Ochola Makanyego and Secretary General of the Kenya Petroleum Oil Workers Union, and Peter Ugo, General Secretary of African Commons Services Civil Servants Union. In June 1969, Tom Mboya, a Luo member of the government, considered a potential successor to the Kenyatta, was assassinated. Hostility between the Kikuyu and Luo was heightened, and after riots broke out in Luo country, KPU was banned. The specific riots that led to the banning of the KPU resulted in the incident referred to the Kisumu Massacre. Kenya thereby became one-party state under the KANU. And so, after all these different resistances started to take place between the KANU, the KANU, and the KPU was officially outlawed, and people who were associated with the KPU were detained and prosecuted without trial. So, with one of the leaders of the original Kikuyu, Kenyatta died in 1978 and was succeeded by Daniel Arap Moi who was born in 1924, who ruled as president during 1978 to 2002. Moi, a member of the Kalenjin ethnic group, excuse me, guys, quickly consolidated his position and governed in an authoritarian and corrupt manner. By 1986, Moi had concentrated all the power and most of its attendant economic benefits into the hand of his Kalenjin tribe of the handful of allies from minority groups. On August 1st, 1982, lower-level Air Force personnel led by Senior Private Grade 1 Hezekiah Achuka and backed by university students, attempted a coup d'etat to oust Moi. The push was quickly suppressed by forces commanded by Army Commander Muhammad Mohammed, a veteran Somali military official. In the coup's aftermath, some of Nairobi's poor Kenyans attacked the looted stores owned by Asians. Robert Oko, the senior low in Moi's cabinet, was appointed to expose corruption at high levels, but was murdered a few months later. Moi's closest association with implications to Uko's murder, Moi's dismissed him, but not before his remaining low support had evaporated. Germany recalled its ambassador to protest the increasing brutality of the regime, and foreign donors possessed Moi to allow other parties, which was done in December 1991 through a constitutional amendment. So now we have the governments of Africa starting to recover, but then you have corruption of like the power vacuum and certain people grabbing for power in this particular region, and then you have a coup to stop this military power from trying to take over, it's just like this mass political fallout from going from being suppressed and oppressed by the British people to gaining your own independence, redistributing the lands to all the different farmers, with uprisings in different groups of people because the redistribution of land is unfair. Certain people aren't getting their land back, while other groups of people are being favored over different tribes. And then you have the power grab of this militant let's see, what's his name again? Daniel Arap Moi. You have that power grab by the general leader Moi. So, constitutionally barred from running in the December 2002 presidential election, Moi unsuccessfully promoted Uhuru Kenyatta, the son of Kenya's first president, as its successor. A rainbow coalition of opposition parties routed the ruling KANU party and its leader. Moi's former vice president, Mwai Kibaki, was elected president by a large majority. On 27 December 2002, by 62% of voters overwhelmingly elected members of the National Rainbow Coalition, the NARC, to Parliament, and NARC candidate Mwai Kibaki to the presidency voters rejected the Kenya African National Union, the KANU, presidential candidate. Uhuru Kenyatta, the hand-picked candidate of outgoing President Moi, international and local observers reported the 2002 elections to be generally more fair and less violent than those of both 1992 and 1997. His strong showing allowed Kibaki to choose a cabinet to seek international support and balance power within the NARC. So now that we have a nomination of Moi, but because of his strong ties to his father and one of the original founders of the Kakuyu group of people, this particular person has strong ties with a lot of the people in the land. So he was actually able to win the election fairly, and because of his ties with the people and his history, his family's history, it ended up being one of the most non-violent votes in this land because of his popularity. So he was favored by a lot of the people in this region. Kenya witnessed a spectacular economic recovery helped by the favorable international environment. The annual rate of growth improved farms, 1.6% in 2002 and 2.6% by 2004 and 3.4% in 2005. 5.5% in 2007. However, social inequalities also increased. The economic benefits went disproportionately to the already well-off, especially to the Kikuyu. Corruption reached new depths. Matching some of the excesses of the Moi years, social conditions deteriorated for ordinary Kenyans who forced a growing wave of routine crime in urban areas, pitched battles between ethnic groups, fighting for land, and feud between the police and Mungiki sect, which left over 120 people dead in November 2007 alone, which is just 15 years ago. So we have a lot of things going on in this region that happened 15 years ago. This happened a year after I graduated from high school. So in a time in the world where I'm growing up as a kid and in high school, not knowing that this kind of stuff is happening around the world, when it clearly is happening around the world. And then what these are just political aftermath effects of slavery and colonial takeover, and then power grabs once the colonials were pushed out and the land was taken back. There was a power vacuum and people went to go grab for power, and then you have corruption taking place. And then when a certain particular group of people, the Kikuyu, won and got their land back, they favored their own group of people versus their kind of like their neighbors. They did give some of the land back, but not as much land as was originally theirs. The Kikuyu people kept more of the land for themselves. So that's where a lot of that corruption stems, and why during this time the Kikuyu were more prosperous, because they unfairly kept more of the land when they gained their land back from the British colonists. Once regarded as the world's most optimistic, Kibaki's regime quickly lost much of its power because it became too closely linked with the discredited Moi forces. The continuity between Kibaki and Moi set the stage for the self-destructive of Kibaki's National Rainbow Coalition, which was dominated by the Kikuyus. The Western Law of Kalenjin groups demanded greater autonomy, backed Raila Amolo Odinga and his Orange Democratic Movement, the ODM. In the December 2007 elections, Odinga, the candidate of the ODM, attacked the failures of the Kibaki region. The ODM charged the Kikuyu with having grabbed everything and all other tribes having lost. That Kibaki had betrayed his promises for change, that crime and violence were out of control, and that economic growth was not bringing any benefits to the ordinary citizen, In the December 2007 election, the ODM won majority seats in the parliament, but the presidential election votes were marred by claims of rigging by both sides. It may never be clear who won the election, but it was roughly 50-50 before the rigging started. So we have claims of election fraud, which we're seeing a lot here, that we saw a lot this past year. But with this, we are seeing a lot of election fraud from both sides. And then even before these claims were made, we had an election that was 50-50. So it's really hard to tell who won this election, with this particular region of the world really split down the middle. But we obviously know what side was at fault, because we know that the Kikuyus pretty much stole the land in terms of, reclaiming the land but not properly distributing it back to its original owners. So they kept it for themselves rather than giving it back. And so that's where that corruption stems, and why the Kikuyus prospered more than the average person or the average populace. The December 2007 election was in part a referendum on Majimboism. It pitted today's Majimboists, represented by Odinga, who campaigned for regionalism, against Kibaki, who stood for the status quo of a highly centralized government that was delivered considerable economic growth, but has repeatedly displayed the problems of too much power concentrated in too few hands, corruption, aloofness, favoritism, and its flip side, marginalization. In the town of Londiani in the Rift Valley, Kikuyus traders settled decades ago. In February 2008, hundreds of Kalenjin raiders poured down from the nearby scruffy hills and burned a Kikuyu school. 300,000 members of the Kikuyu community were displaced from Rift Valley province. Kikuyus quickly took revenge, organizing into gangs armed with iron bars and table legs, and hunted down Luos and Kalenjis in Kikuyu-dominated areas of the Nakuru. We are achieving our own perverse versions of Majimboism, wrote one of the Kenya leaders, columnist Machario Gaito. The Luo population of the Southwest had enjoyed an advantageous position during the late colonial and early independence periods of the 1950s and 1960s and the early 1970s, particularly in terms of the prominence of its modern elite compared to those of other groups. However, the Luo lost prominence due to the success of Kikuyu and related groups. So that's pretty much it for the history of the Kenya region. We have a lot going on here. Even to this day, a lot of the conflict isn't resolved. We have a lot going on. As you can see, the story doesn't really resolve itself. There's still a lot of conflict, a lot of things going on. The latest thing that I have on here is goes up to 2008. So we have that the most recent election of the, I don't know if there has been an election since 2008, but the 2008 is the last documented election on here. And we have the uprising of we have the suppression of the Kikuyu people, who really took away from the rest of the people, and then you have the President Moi, who really brought about the downfall of the Kikuyu people by his corruption. And then allowing the main populace to open up their eyes and really revolt against the groups that were treating each other unfairly. So it's very interesting how You know, way back you have the British colonials coming in, taking the land away from the people, really suppressing the African population and taking advantage of their situation. And then you have the uprising of the African people, and then you have conflict between the British colonials and the German colonials in a fight for land between farms. And then you have that uprising continuing to grow, and then finally being able to acquire rights and getting their land back through diplomatic and also other groups of people through violence. But that's mainly just fighting for your homeland, getting it back. And so there's people that fought on the political front, and then people that fought on the actual the battlefield. So you have two different fronts being fought by the African people politically and violently, just to get their home back. And then once finally they got their land back, there was unfair redistribution of the land, which caused fighting amongst tribes in this region. Tribes who started their own groups of people, really fighting for fairness. And so you have a lot of political things going on in this region of the world, and them fighting for democracy and socialism, and really them trying to figure out where their place is in the world and how they're going to manage the land and its people. And so even to this day, they're still going through the aftermath and political fallout that was the British colonialism and the reacquisition of their land and farms, and the fallout of the unfair distribution of the land. And so this is the story of Kenya and how it impacts the local African in that particular world, and that's their story. So I want to thank everyone for joining me in today's live stream. Today was an extra long live stream because we really went down into the roots of the African culture in celebration of Black History Month. Thank you guys so much for joining me for today's story. I know I learned a lot, especially about the Kenya region and about British colonialism and how wrong it was, and the vile things they did to this particular group of people from this particular area of the world. And then not only what they did, but just the political fallout from everything that they did. So when they reacquired their land and all this fighting happened between different tribes for even redistribution of land and farm, we really get to see the consequences of the choices that we've made in the past, and how it affects the future, and then how it's still in effect today, 80 years from the original choices that they made. So 80 years from now, a choice that you make today could really impact what's happening in the future. And this story is all about the suffering and strife that the African community has gone through, and how they really bounced back, and how they're really growing today, and creating new policies and making sure that future generations have a sustainable life and are being treated fairly. So again, thank you guys, everyone, for joining me in today's extra long coffee tasting and the coffee story of Kenya. I will be super honored if you guys join me this Friday, where we'll be tasting Komodo Dragon with my we'll be having a special guest host, Mark, and he is going to be exploring his favorite coffee, which is the Komodo Dragon, and we're going to be talking a little bit about that. So thanks again, everyone, for joining me in today's coffee tasting. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I hope you guys learned a little bit about the Kenya history, and you guys really appreciate that story. Thanks again. Have a great day, guys. If you guys enjoyed today's coffee tasting and today's Black History Month story, go ahead and hit the link down below. That is going to be a list of videos that I have done in the past. The link above is just a video that YouTube thinks that you might like. Thanks again for joining, and have a great day, you guys.